Started, folks. I do not have Brian with me today, but I am joined by Stephen Fagin. Stephen is the curator of the Sixth Floor Museum in Dallas. That's where JFK was assassinated. Phil Kelly actually contributed to some exhibitions at the museum, and that is why we have Stephen on today. Stephen is going to give us some insight into how Phil came to be associated with the project. And well, Stephen, I guess at some point you met Phil back when you started in 2000 as the curator. I know that the museum had already been open for 10 years by then. By the way, it's a lovely museum. I was there a couple of months ago, and it's just incredible what has been done to make that a national treasure. So, when Phil was involved in the project at the beginning, can you kind of shed some light on how he was approached and what went into his contribution?
Sure, I would be happy to, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure. I only got to meet Phil Kelly by telephone. We had a two-part telephone interview years ago as part of our museum's oral history project, but it was a great honor to get to record his recollections of the contributions that he made to the sixth floor exhibit here in Dallas. So to kind of set the scene, this building where I'm at, the Texas School Book Depository building, which of course is where shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade back in November of 1963, this building was really in danger of being torn down in the 1970s. There were a number of community leaders here in Dallas that felt this building was a painful reminder of what happened here, the darkest moment in the city's modern history. And so there was a lot of debate and controversy over what should happen with this structure. And ultimately, in the late 70s, Dallas County purchased the building to renovate the first 5 floors into the new seat of county government. But they left the 6th floor where the 3 empty rifle shells were found by an open window and where the rifle itself was found. They left that floor and the floor above open in the hopes that one day some sort of historical exhibition could be achieved. And it took about 12 years of very controversial development for what became the sixth floor exhibit to come together and open actually on February 20th. 1989. Today, we're recording this on February 20th, 2026. So the museum is officially 37 years old today. This is actually the museum's anniversary, interestingly
Very
enough.
nice.
So in order to tell this story properly, the founders of this museum went to a couple of local documentarians, Alan and Cynthia Mondell, a fantastic couple who had already established a reputation as phenomenal local filmmakers here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. In fact, Alan was serving in the Peace Corps in Sierra Leone at the time of the Kennedy assassination in 1963. So the Mondells were particularly qualified to contribute to the films that made up the museum's original exhibit. And so our museum, the original core exhibit that opened in '89, most of which is still on display today, walks you through the life, death, and legacy of President Kennedy. And in doing so, there's lots of text panels, photographs, and artifacts. But in the museum world, you really got two audiences. You have readers who read all the text, and runners who typically watch the videos, look at the artifacts, and kind of go through the museum fairly briskly. So the videos were very significant because essentially they are summarizing a lot of the rich content that you find on the photographic and text panels. And so the Mondells really had their work cut out for them. And ultimately what happened, the Mondells put together 4 short documentaries that are in these standing kiosks. So as people move through the museum section by section, there are these little kiosks that they can stand in front of and watch these little videos that summarize the information from that section, as well as 2 seated theater films. And so in order, just so we kind of establish the films that Phil worked on, you have the 1960s, which is really all about the Kennedy presidency, the race for the White House, the social and political issues of the day. It's the presidency, essentially. Then you have the trip to Texas, which is all about that fateful trip in the fall of 1963, where the president and first lady went to these major cities in Texas, ending, of course, unfortunately, here in Dallas with the assassination. And then you have, following the shooting, a video called The Crisis Hours, which is all about the arrest of the accused assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, who worked here in the depository, and then Oswald being shot by Jack Ruby, a local nightclub owner, on live television just 2 days later. And then you have a seated film, which is called The Nation and World Respond. And that's about a 10-minute film with no narration that simply shows footage from the Kennedy funeral and footage of memorial services around the world. And that was actually Phil Kelly's favorite film to work on, and I'll hopefully get to talk a little bit more about that. And then you have another standing kiosk called The Investigations, which is all about the government inquiries into the assassination, as well as some of the lingering questions and conspiracy theories. And then finally, the museum concludes with another seated theater, and that was called The Legacy. And when we opened in '89, that film was hosted by legendary CBS broadcaster Walter Cronkite. And so the Mondells put together these 6 films, 4 standing kiosks, 2 theater films, and they needed a composer. They needed a soundtrack to guide people through their sixth floor experience. And so Phil Kelly had met the Mondells, I think about 10 to 15 years prior to their work on the sixth floor. He had done some composition work for at least 1 or 2 documentaries that the Mondells had worked on. And so they were already very familiar with Phil and his work. And they approached him and said, we think this would be a good project for you. And so Phil came on board immediately. Phil Kelly was actually in Dallas when President Kennedy, or he was in Dallas, I believe, the morning of the assassination. He was a traveling musician, a drummer, and he had stayed the night before, I believe, at the Cabana Motel in Dallas, which was kind of a swanky place at the time in 1963. And I believe he shares in his oral history that he left Dallas that morning, and the assassination took place while he was en route to his destination. And it wasn't until he landed where he was going that he found out the president had been killed. And like so many, he was, devastated by the news. He mentioned that Kennedy was the first president he voted for, because he would have been 21 for the first time, the age you needed to be to vote in 1960 when Kennedy ran against Richard Nixon. So this was a meaningful project, I think, for Phil to get to contribute to these films. And so he composed the soundtrack to all 6 of these documentary films that play on the sixth floor. And we can go into some detail about that. But interestingly enough, 5 of those 6 films continue to play here 37 years later. So Phil Kelly's work is still heard by tens of thousands of people. Millions of people over the years have heard his work as they navigate the sixth floor. And honestly, as a young person, I visited the museum the week it opened in 1989, about 11 years before I first came to work here. I cannot imagine the sixth floor experience without that soundtrack. I think Phil Kelly in my head when I am on that floor. I'm sometimes in the museum when it's quiet and all the AV is shut off, and it just doesn't feel right because I need that soundtrack. And so unquestionably, Phil Kelly contributed to how people experience this National Historic Landmark.
Let's speak to that first audiovisual booth that features the funeral,
Mhm.
because that stood out to me as well. I do recall that there was some music in there, atonal, uh, despondent. It sounded like everything was out of whack. He really hit the mood with that. But also, I remember bagpipes and drums, and I know that was part of the funeral, but I don't believe that was actually recordings from the actual funeral. That might have been music that Phil maybe put in there. Also, the taps. it just sounded too clean to be a recording from 1963. So do you think that maybe along with the original music that he put in that those musical effects into the footage of the
Well,
funeral as well?
yeah, well, actually, we talked quite a bit about that funeral film because it is really where his music stands out the most. All the other films, you hear original broadcasters from 1963 talking, or there's narration, but that film, The Mondells, specifically wanted people to feel what was going on rather than necessarily absorb any information. So the music was crucial there. And actually, Phil told me that he did use original recordings from 1963. At times, they had to change the key a little bit. They had to do some augmentation. But he said that the greatest challenge he had on the entire Sixth Floor project was composing original synthesized music that would link up with these historical recordings in a way that felt, as you pointed out, seamless, where it all feels like it's part of the same soundtrack, but really that's the music of Phil Kelly blended with original music from the Kennedy funeral. It's really extraordinary. Even that recording of Taps, that is the original recording of Taps that was
Okay.
performed at Arlington National Cemetery on November 25th, 1963. So we're talking about music in 1988, seamlessly married to original music from 1963. It's really, he did an excellent job. And incidentally, he mentions that, for the portion of the film that shows the memorial services around the world, he mentioned that there were some, I believe, some memorial services in Asia. And so he very deliberately kind of put an Eastern theme in there to help kind of characterize the footage we were watching. Because again, all we're hearing is music, and this stark, painful black and white footage as the president is laid to rest and his people around the world mourn his passing. So Phil definitely said that that was the film that was the hardest to do, but also meant the most to him.
Well, that was it, it definitely struck a chord. I remember sitting in the booth listening to that, and I thought he just hit the emotions right on. I bought a book from the gift shop when I left the museum. It was Death of a President by William Manchester. So it helped me catch up with what I had forgotten about everything that happened around that time. But when I was in that booth, and also at the Legacy booth as well, I could pick out his music, and I had a suspicion that he had something to do with some of those celebration or those the music for like from Asia in the booth.
Mhm.
That's very good to know about taps and the caissons that he was not. It wasn't all recreated in modern times. There were sound clips from 1963 that he employed in there as well.
Yeah, there were a lot of budget restraints on this project because, again, it was a controversial project. Fundraising was quite difficult because you're talking about, a really dark moment, a painful moment, and particularly for Dallas residents, there was a lot of hesitation. Exactly what would the sixth floor museum be when it opened, and there was some concern about the dignity of such an exhibition. And so, fortunately, that all played out quite well. I mean, the vast majority of the people, whether they're from this area or from around the world, are struck by the reverence given to the subject matter and how it does not in any way glorify the accused assassin, which is what some people feared it might, or commercialize the event in any way. It is a very respectful exploration of the time period that tries to take what Kennedy stood for and link it to our lives today, making it relevant for these younger visitors that continue to come to the museum year after year after year. But in those early days, people were very hesitant, and so there were some budget restraints. And Phil mentioned that he would have preferred to record with an orchestra. He really felt like this was an orchestral soundtrack, but because of those budget constraints, it ended up being almost entirely synthesized. What's interesting though is that this is synthesized music from the late 80s, but it's timeless. It does not, when you're up in that exhibit, you don't feel like, oh, this is from like 1988, 89. It really feels like it has always been there, and it's the most appropriate soundtrack to that experience. It really has withstood the test of time.
And that's part of the magic of Phil Kelly. He was so versatile. Because in his career he had to cater to the needs of his clientele, and they wanted so many different things. And so, from decades of experience, he was able to adjust and make music that magically fit the need.
Yeah.
So he was the perfect candidate for your museum. Well, just as an aside, I you said February today, February 20th is the exact anniversary date of the opening. I was born on the very day that Oswald was shot.
Wow.
So for me to go in there, it's almost like being seeing the day of my birth. To find out that Phil Kelly was involved in it once I got involved in this project was just made it so much more fascinating. So I will be back. Hopefully, I'll get to meet you in person one day, and I'll bring Brian with me. And well, Brian sends his regards. He thanks you very much for your help on this project, and you've been very informative. Stephen, I do appreciate your time. Thank you very
Oh,
much.
my
And
pleasure meeting you. And I do hope to see you here in Dallas, and Brian as well.
absolutely.